These covenants were deeds of lofty imperial significance. The Reformation of the Church, however complete, would have been a limited Reformation. There are two powers ordained of God, and both must be reformed. The comprehensive aims of the Covenanters embraced both state and church. Their deeds were civil as well as ecclesiastical. A church thoroughly reformed and Christian in a state unreformed and anti-Christian would never have satisfied the reformers. The state also must be no longer a vassal of the Pope. It must be a servant of the blessed and only potentate. God in his mighty word, here also as in the church, must be joyfully granted the exclusive supremacy. The Covenanters vowed to defend the king in the defense and preservation of the Reformed religion. They secured the recognition of the church by Parliament. The members of Parliament themselves became Covenanters. In short, Christianity pervaded and adorned the constitution and administration of civil government in the United Kingdom. The Covenanters were convinced that no power, except that provided by the Word of God, could possibly resist the arbitrary claims of the monarchs, secure the safety of the state, and promote civil liberty in the land. Religion in the realm of citizenship is the very crown of any realm. In the face of the despotisms of pope and monarch, it would not have been surprising had the Covenanters invented and endeavored to apply to the state the modern theory of religious equality, which denies the right of the state to even acknowledge the prince of the kings of the earth. If ever they dreamt of such a theory, their thought of the supremacy of Jesus would make it vanish as a dream. Much less would they ever admit the possibility of deliverance by the theory of a concurrent recognition of all religions, as this would lower a nation to the position of heathenism with its gods many, and would soon involve the strongest empire in disaster. Papalism in the state in the ascendancy, absolute monarchism in the state, secularism in the state, polytheism in the state, these are four despotisms and must be flung with detestation out of all Christian lands. The state that is not on the side of Christ and Christ alone is an antagonism to all the moral forces of the universe. Its throne is against the throne of the highest. The Scottish Covenanters placed the crown of the state on the head of its rightful monarch, and so lifted their kingdom to imperial grandeur. There are some spots of this world that have secured undying memorials, as they have been stages for the settlement of questions of momentous importance in the destinies of nations. There is Marathon in Greece, Waterloo in France, Sadowa in Austria, Trafalgar on the sea, but probably the scenes associated with these pale in glory in the presence of Greyfriars in Westminster, where nations won unparalleled victories in the surrender of themselves to their covenant God. These two spots were the earthly centers of spiritual movements of mighty magnitude, and possess in the eyes of the God of heaven and of the principalities about his throne a splendor not eclipsed by any that ever shone on a battlefield. When the day of millennial glory comes, the people of the new era will not look to the Sadowas and the Sedans, but to much spots as these, where the greatest heroes of the premillennial times reflected millennial light and anticipated millennial triumphs. For there, by an army without sword or spear, the absolutism of monarchies and the tyranny of hierarchies were scattered like chaff before the wind. As the Covenanters entered into and rejoiced in their vows to God, the imperialism of King Jesus conquered the imperialism which prince and priest had been enforcing with rigor. And this imperialism shall be in the ascendancy yet the world over, when the empires of earth shall crown the Christ of God as King of the Church and King of nations. But the Covenanters have scarce time to estimate and enjoy the benefits of their conquests before a tempest burst forth suddenly and threatened the destruction of all the attainments of the past. In a moment, the national infatuation, the Stuart dynasty, was restored to the throne, and Charles II instantly proceeded to set up once more the Dagon of the royal supremacy, and enforced its recognition by all his power. On 2 occasions he had subscribed the Solemn League, and he had issued instructions in its favor, professing warm admiration of both covenants and of the Reformation. But now the perjured monarch employed all his craft and power to overthrow the whole covenanted Reformation in church and state. Parliament, the slave of his behests, passed the Act of Supremacy, giving legislative sanction to all the rights he claimed. The Acts Recissory followed, declaring the covenants unlawful and seditious deeds, and repealing all parliamentary laws in their favor. Then came the abolition of Presbyterianism, indulgences, the restoration of prelacy, the appointment of high commission courts, the ejection of all ministers who would not obey the royal mandates, and the erection of scaffolds. The monarch seemed determined to extinguish every spark of liberty in the kingdom. The reign of peace was supplanted by a reign of terror. The covenants were broken, burnt, buried by public orders. The Covenanters met to worship God in the moorlands and dells, setting a watch for the dragoons of Claverhouse. Thousands upon thousands of the noblest patriots were imprisoned, tortured, mangled, and shot. At times their indignation burst forth through arms, as at Rullion Green, Drumclog, and Bothwell Bridge. Their most brilliant victories were on the scaffold, when they passed triumphantly to the crown, for there was, quote, a noble army, unquote, of martyrs, from Argyle, the proto-martyr of the killing times, down to the youthful Renwick, last of the white-robed throng. The ruin wrought by Charles I in England, quote, "We have likened," says Dr. Wiley, "to a tropical sunset, where night follows day at a single stride. But the fall of Scotland into the abyss of oppression and suffering under Charles II was like a disastrous eclipse of the sun in his meridian height, bringing dismal night over the shuddering earth at the hour of noon." Unquote. Quote, "The hills with the deep mournful music were ringing, the curlew and plover in concert were singing, but the melody died midst derision and laughter, as the hosts of ungodly rushed on to the slaughter. When the righteous had fallen and the combat had ended, a chariot of fire through the dark cloud descended. The drivers were angels on horses of whiteness, and its burning wheels turned on axles of brightness. On the arch of the rainbow the chariot is gliding, through the paths of the thunder the horsemen are riding. Glide swiftly, bright spirits, the prize is before you, a crown never fading, a kingdom of glory." Unquote. Throughout the long 30 years of persecution, the disseminated Covenanters still lived. The banner for Christ's crown and covenant was still waved by them through the blood-stained land. Oftentimes they issued declarations and protests against the tyranny of their oppressors, many of which concluded with those inspiriting words at the close of the last of them, quote, "Let King Jesus reign, and all his enemies be scattered." Unquote. The most famous of these papers was the San Juan Declaration. On the 22nd of June, 1680, 20 horsemen rode into the burgh of San Juan, and at the market cross read their declaration, in which they, quote, "disowned Charles Stuart, that has been reigning, or rather tyrannizing, as we may say, on the throne of Britain these years bygone, as having any right, title to, or interest in the said crown of Scotland for government, as forfeited several years since by his perjury and breach of covenant both to God and his kirk, and usurpation of his crown and royal prerogatives therein." Unquote. That courageous act of those 20 patriots proclaimed the doom of the House of Stuart. Quote, "Men call it rash, perhaps it was a crime. Their deeds flashed out God's will an hour before the time." Unquote. A few years afterwards, the nations of England and Scotland endorsed the action of Richard Cameron and his compatriots. The blood of Guthrie and Cargill and MacHale had cried for vengeance, and the God of the Covenanters hurled the Stuart dynasty from the throne. Quote, "Alas, is it not true," writes Carlyle in his Heroes, "that many men in the van do always, like Russian soldiers, march into the ditch of Sagewignitz and fill it up with their dead bodies, that the rear may pass over them dry-shod and gain the honor? How many earnest, rugged Cromwells, Knoxes, poor peasant Covenanters, wrestling, battling for very life in rough, miry places, have to struggle and suffer and fall greatly censured, bemired, for a beautiful revolution of 88 can step over them in official pumps and silk stockings with universal 3 times 3, unquote. The steadfast followers of the Covenanters expected that on the cessation of the persecution, there would be the restoration of the whole covenanted Reformation in church and state. But their just expectations were doomed to bitter disappointment. Neither by church nor state was any proposal ever seriously entertained of renewing the national covenants with God as at the commencement of the Second Reformation. Instead, the Acts Recissory were permitted to remain on the statute book, and the covenants to lie under the infamy to which the king and the royalists had consigned them. The state exerted an Erastian control of the church, and the church yielded submission. Her standards were assigned her before she met. Her assemblies were summoned and prorogued at the sovereign's pleasure. Presbyterianism was established, not because it possessed a jus divinum, but because the people willed it. Her government was controlled through the admission into her ministry, by royal request, of many who had accepted indulgences and were supporters of prelacy. The whole period of the Second Reformation was almost annihilated by the settlement of the Church, not according to the periods 1638 and 1643, but according to 1592. The acts of the assemblies of the Revolution Church never once mentioned the Solemn League and Covenant. Ministers who pled for its recognition exposed themselves to the censures of their brethren. An attempt by the Church, soon after the Revolution, to assert the supremacy of Christ and the Church's independence under him, issued in the dissolution of the Assembly by the Royal Commissioner. And this departure of the Church and State at the Revolution was strikingly and sadly endorsed when, at the union with England, Scotland consented that the prelatic establishment in England should be allowed to remain, quote, inviolable forever, unquote. A few, quote, stones had been gathered from the wreck of the Reformation to be incorporated with the new structure, but the venerable fabric itself was left in ruins, unquote. Yes, the Revolution came, but not the Reformation. The sword was returned to its scabbard, but church and state did not return to their covenant God, into sympathy and fellowship with institutions founded on principles subversive of those they had vowed to maintain. The faithful followers of the Reformers and Martyrs could not enter. The banner for Christ's crown and covenant had waved over the fields of Scotland when the storms of persecution had raged most fiercely. And how could they be justified in dropping it now, when the God of Zion was pleased to command a calm? The minority, who thus preserved an unbroken relationship with the pre-revolution and martyr period, continued to meet in, quote, societies, unquote, for 16 years, when they were joined by a minister, Reverend John Macmillan, who was driven out of the Revolution Church because of his testimony for the whole covenanted Reformation. Some years afterward, another minister espoused the cause then represented by Mr. Macmillan and the United Societies, and this union resulted in the constitution of the Reformed Presbytery. 2 years afterward, in 1745, the members of the Reformed Presbyterian Church engaged in the work of covenant renovation at Crawford John in Lanarkshire. Since that time, this church has had an unbroken history, excepting a disruption in 1863, when a majority departed from her distinctive position. But what is the bearing of Scotland's covenanted Reformation of 3 centuries ago on the Scotland of the present times? Has it no instruction for all times? Is the whole prolonged struggle, with all its checkered scenes, but a panorama on which spectators may gaze but with passing emotions? Is it all but a story with interest, however thrilling for the study of the antiquarian? If so, then the whole contendings of reformers and covenanters and martyrs sink into insignificance indeed. They had been assigned a magnitude far beyond their desert. If the doctrines and principles for whose application in church and state they fought and suffered were unscriptural, then let an enlightened posterity bury with shame the story of their warfare. Or, if they were of mere temporary importance, then the Covenanters merit no higher admiration than that accorded to those who, like the Armenians now in Turkey, cry out against the oppressions of the civil power. But these doctrines and principles were brought from the Word of God, and possess imperishable excellency. Their glory was not temporal, it is eternal. And they shall yet undergo a resurrection and receive universally a joyous recognition. The obligation of these national covenants on the British nation still has been oftentimes demonstrated by indisputable arguments. The Word of God teaches in the most pointed manner this principle of devolving covenant obligation. The God of Israel threatened his people with chastisement for breaking the covenant he had made with their fathers 400 years before.